It's not something that we see on TV that's far away. That was the connection we had with who we were a bit.
That's probably one of the hardest experiences that you've had to face, especially as an early career professional. Hello and welcome to Critters and Cultures, the podcast where we explore the fascinating intersection of animal welfare and cultural diversity. I'm your host and veterinarian, Dr. Azalia Boyd, ready to uncover how our cultural differences influence, enhance, and sometimes challenge the way we care for animals and relate to each other. Join us on this journey through global traditions, learning from diverse perspectives, and advocating for empathy and respect in all of our interactions. This episode is made possible thanks to Maddie's Funds, championing a more inclusive, innovative, and compassionate world for pets and people. So #thanks to Maddie's. And thank you guys, all the listeners and viewers, for joining me on another episode of Critters and Cultures. If something resonates with you during the podcast today, please feel free to send me a direct message, comment below, or even reach out to our guests. Speaking of guests, today we have another incredible guest, Dr. Navaratnam Partheeban. He is a farm animal veterinarian, a global scholar, and advocate for racial equity in agriculture and veterinary medicine. He graduated from the Royal School of Studies in Edinburgh and has spent his career working across clinical practice, academia, and industry. From livestock clinics in the UK to research initiatives in the US, China, South Africa, his work reflects a deep commitment to improving both animal care and human understanding. I am super excited to introduce Dr. Partheeban, who we're going to call Phoebe. We're friends now, so I get to call you Phoebe, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Okay, well, I always have an icebreaker question, so we might as well get right into the icebreaker before we get into your incredible work. What's something about your relationship with animals or the outdoors as a kid that still sticks with you today?
I think the big thing for me was just the sheer size of livestock. I think when I was young, I didn't have animals, or I sort of imagined them, I loved them, but I never really had much interaction with them. And I think when I went to vet school, I just imagined I'd be a small animal vet. And I think working with cattle and sheep and just the size of them, the smells, the way you work with them, I was just amazed. But then there was something in me, it lit a fire in my heart. And I think, that's where I went down. But it's just incredible, I think. You see something new every time.
That is incredible. I usually tell the story that I'm originally a New Yorker from New York, and I didn't see cattle at all. It was literally just a figment of my imagination or in storybook. And it wasn't until I got to the South that I actually started to see land and all of that. I know we're going to get into some of that during the episode, so thank you for sharing. But let's talk about your origin story then. So who are you really? Tell us about Phoebe.
About Phoebe. Okay, so yeah, I was born and bred in Edinburgh, and I've always been interested in science and animals and people and all those things. So, so that's what's brought me into this sector.
Let's back it up even more than that. Before you got to this sector, we want to know a little bit about you. Tell me about your cultural background, maybe about your upbringing even.
Oh, okay, yeah. So both my parents were immigrants into the UK from Sri Lanka and Malaysia. And so I'm a second generation immigrant in the UK. And I had an upbringing in towns and cities, mostly in the north of the UK, if you know the UK, so Scotland and Yorkshire. And, it was a fairly typical sort of, I'm Hindu and I've got a Tamil background. But actually, when I was growing up, we lived in very white neighbourhoods and very white areas. I went to white schools. I was sort of encouraged to understand, that sort of culture. My own culture, I didn't really understand it as much as I did until I started going to secondary school and seeing more people like me. So, actually I knew Christianity better and could understand the Bible better than my own scripts and my own religion. But I think I came up with the immigrant background because, again, my parents came here and they had to assimilate and they had to try to survive, and they wanted their children to survive. And I think it's a common immigrant story where you just have to understand the language better. So, my parents speak Tamil, but I had to Tamil at home, but English everywhere else. I had to understand the culture, the food, everything like that. So I had a different home upbringing and a different school / outside of the home upbringing. So there's two worlds, and they were sort of quite distinct. And I think actually as I become older, I've realised that I've got to try and merge the two and try and become more authentic. And I think I've got the opportunity with my children, and that's what I try and do with my children, is I want them to be them, whether they're at home or they're outside of home. Something that I didn't have an opportunity to, but that's what we're trying to do, break down these barriers going forward.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. And I was reflecting on that as you were speaking. I also first generation American, because my parents are Caribbean, and my world inside of our home was a lot different than the world outside, right? We couldn't play reggae music music very loudly. Otherwise, we get looked at funny. My parents' accent, they have it still, it's
Yeah.
very deep. But, the what we call patois, the Caribbean accent, essentially had to be disguised because, again, it's this whole point of assimilation. And how fortunate of us to be able to teach our children to be authentic, right? So, back then, maybe our parents couldn't do what we're able to do now and be authentic, be yourself, all of these things. You have an amazing cultural upbringing. So in your home, did you guys practice Hinduism? Did you
Yeah,
speak the
yeah.
language in the home and eat the food and all of that? But when
100%.
you were outside, it was completely different.
Exactly. Do you know, like at home, it was very Tamil culture. My parents spoke Tamil to us. We ate Tamil food. The other thing about it is, like, my parents came from villages from where they came from. So there was a lot about the village. All our stories about their childhood and their upbringing was about village stories, about having the cow and having a few chickens and walking to school in miles in the heat and all those things. And also my parents, my bedtime stories were Hindu mythology and stories like that. So that was the stuff that I brought up with at home. That was the connection we had with who we were a bit. But the problem was we weren't then allowed to do it outside of the house. It was fascinating. But again, where we live, especially in Scotland and north of England, there weren't other people, other Tamils or anybody like that. So actually, my parents would sometimes drive 4 or 5 hours once a week or once a month to go and get groceries. So we'd have to go to the Indian or the Tamil shops in London, buy our groceries, go back, and then they would use that to cook. And so that was my childhood. That's the only time I saw other people like me, was probably once a month when we came down to London and then we went back up north. But things are changing now and there are more people over. But it was magical at home because, again, wearing saris and things like that. And my parents loved Tamil movies. So you see all that stuff. You had an imagery of what it was like, but you never saw it outside your house. You looked out windows and it wasn't what you saw at home.
Right. And just imagine coming home and that feeling of being home. I'm sure this warmth and comfort, right?
Exactly.
Around being what you're familiar with, and what your cultural heritage and upbringing is. So your relationship, we talk a lot about the human-animal bond, and I just want to touch on that. I'm a small animal veterinarian, so my bond is primarily with cats and dogs, right? Tell me about the human-animal bond as a farm animal veterinarian. Do you have a special, relationship with the sheep, the goats, the cattle? What is that?
Despite them being 300 or 500 in front of you, I think you have the bond as in they're still an animal and they still need care. I think we all come into the animal field because we love animals, and we might have a favourite compared to another, but we're all got empathy for empathy. I think is the big one, and I think we all come into this field initially because of empathy. Whether later on it's because we want more money or more fame or whatever, but we all come with empathy, and I think that's our special power. As a farm animal vet, we have so much empathy for these animals, and we care about them because that's fundamentally why we're a vet. And for me specifically, and I talked about cows earlier, in Hinduism, the cow is the most sacred animal, because when you're born, and this is why cows are important, when you're born, and let's say unfortunately your mother passes away or can't look after you or can't produce milk, the cow can sustain you, and the cow can provide milk and bring up a baby. And actually, as a food source, milk is a complete food. It has everything you need. You can live on milk. So as a Hindu, I have a lot of a cow has a huge cultural significance, and therefore when I work with cows, I sort of bring that with me. So I think it's empathy, and I think it's the power of cows that I think drives me and many other vets as well.
Yeah. Do you believe your Hinduism led you to want to care for cows?
I think subconsciously, probably. Because it's in everything. Everything. When my mum tells stories, about the gods, there's always cows involved somewhere. When you see pictures of gods and stories, there's always cows involved. And when we look at pictures of this countryside from Asia and places like that, there's always cows in the background. So I think maybe she was like drip feeding me when I was a child, and I subconsciously believed in it when I was an adult. But actually, it was questioned when I first became a vet. Would I be comfortable putting a cow down as a farm vet? And I just thought, well, actually, the empathy. I have empathy for an animal. If an animal's suffering, that's what we're lucky we're able to do, is put an animal down if the pain or the suffering goes beyond any veterinary intervention or help that can make things better. So I am comfortable doing that because I know it's the best for the animal. So yeah, I think that's important about our cultures, but about our empathy for animals.
What are some of the things that you would hear in those stories about cows? Was it they were magical, mystical, they had wings, they were protectors? Was it just their sacredness?
They're safe, so that they're like a mother. Because they can provide milk and because they can feed you from birth, they're like a mother. And also they have calves, and the mother cow can produce animals that can plough the land, when you think of the bulls, but then that cow can produce food for you, and that cow can produce dung to grow your crops. And so as an animal, to survive we need food, and yet that animal as an animal can provide all those things, can produce the work, the force to plough the land, the dung to grow the crops, and the milk to keep you alive. And I think for me, when you talk about stories, and when my mum talked about her village life, and everybody had a cow with a bell on it, and you'd have calves, and you'd put the bells on so you'd remember where they were if they ran away. It was just growing up. You grew up with those animals as part of life, and so yeah, it just feels like a natural thing. And actually, you know, there's a harvest festival in April, and it's a 4-day festival, and the third day is dedicated to cows. So, you know, the first day is all about the sun, the second day is about crops, but the third day is specifically cows compared to any other animal. So I think that's why it's so revered, and it has so much significance.
That's amazing. I look at you and I say, Fee, to me, you look like a black man. I'm in the US, you're in the UK. It's almost like you're a minority within a minority group.
That is true. That is true. Do you know what? I think this is the big assumption that, you know, like, all brown people are one culture, one people. All black people are one culture, one people. But actually, there's so much diversity within, you know, race, if you want to use a term. Yeah. But, you know, there's so much diversity among us, and it's sad that sometimes we're put in boxes that we have to be. But yeah, like you said, like, I'm not Indian, so actually I am a minority within a minority, and there's colorism within our cultures, and there's so many different things. So there's so much more to learn, isn't there? And so much diversity, which I think makes it beautiful.
And this is why it's important to have conversations with people, right? And really get to know people and take individuals for who they are. I want to dive into this farm life, okay? Because that is like a core piece to your professional upbringing. So when most people think about veterinary medicine, like you said, you mentioned, right, going to small animal medicine, cats, dogs, maybe an occasional exotic pet, but farm animal practice, that rarely enters the conversation. It's almost like agriculture, farm animal, and vet med are seen as separate worlds, even though they're deeply intertwined, right? How did you get into farm animal?
Well, so, like I said earlier, when I went to vet school, I'd never been around a cow or a sheep or anything. And actually, when I was around them, I just had this natural desire to learn more about them, to work with them, to seek out more opportunities. And I didn't really get that buzz with small animal and with equine. And in veterinary, like you'll know, it's quite structured. So you have to see a certain amount of farm and certain amount, well, sheep and cows and pigs, whatever. So it forced you to go out and seek out these opportunities. And then what I realised was, after about 3 years of vet school, I decided, you know what, I really am passionate about this thing. I'm going to try and do as much as I can. So I tried to construct all my experience around cattle and sheep and pigs. And then I think it was that sort of final year. But the thing is, I never looked like anybody I'd ever worked around. You know, I was always around people that didn't look like me, that didn't sound like me, that didn't have any life experience like me. So it was always like, well, I always had to just sit there and try and learn and absorb. And I didn't have many opportunities to share who I was. But at the end of the day, for me, it was all about the career. It wasn't about being a person within this. So I did that. I tried to get my exam results, tried to get my CV up to date so that when I did apply, I could compete at an equal standing against somebody who was born on a farm, or who knew the farming slang, or who had all those sort of things. And I think when you do that, you do find people that do support you or do inspire you. And I had that there's a certain vet up in Scotland, in southwest of Scotland, who took me under his wing and spent evenings with me going over different bits and pieces. And he inspired me that way. And other people saying, you know, doesn't matter if you don't look like somebody like that, or you sound like somebody like that, go for it. I'm an equine vet and I never rode a horse until I was 18. If I can do that, you can do it. So I think it was people that believed in me, I think, was some of the inspiration, plus my desire to do something that I am passionate about. And then, we left vet school, started applying for jobs, and, we could probably chat about that, and you probably could understand that, but it took a while. And then when I got my first break, once you're on the ladder, it just helped my career going forward.
Briefly take us through a day of a farm animal veterinarian. What does that look like?
So it can vary, really. So when I started, I was sort of doing sheep and cattle, beef, and a day would be, there'd be a emergency, so they always get calving problems and things like that. It's very seasonal, so spring you are flat out lambing sheep and calving cows and dealing with all the problems, and then catch summer and it's dead because all the cattle are grazing and all the sheep are out. It's dead. You can take all your holidays, you'll be in practice, you'll have maybe one call all day, and then it comes to autumn and it suddenly goes back up again, and then you're flat out doing those things. Then I specified purely in dairy, and dairy is more flat because, again, a lot of cows are milking throughout the year, so you don't get those emergencies of calving problems and things like that, but you might get other emergencies like twisted stomachs, left place ademasums, or milk fevers, hypocalcemia. But then also it's more herd health, so you're dealing with nutrition, and you're dealing with milk constituents, and you're dealing with foot health. So it's more unsteady, but you don't get those really crazy emergencies at night. It's much quieter at night. So yeah, as a farm vet, it can vary, but I think we're going down the level of it's more data driven, and it's more about doing that herd health thing rather than reducing the amount of emergencies.
Okay, it's fascinating that, when I think GP, I think general practice. I'm seeing doing wellness exams, preventative care, and then later on, if I wanted to change kind of sectors in the career, I would do emergency medicine. It sounds like you kind of have to be, when you're doing farm animal, preventative, emergence, and all things in between.
That's it, exactly. You're doing the nutrition, you're doing the data analysis, you're doing the
research, right?
emergencies. Yeah, exactly. And I think why I think that's what some of the interest of it as well, because I think it's business to business. And so you're also doing the profitability and the business side of things. But as a farm vet, you can find your niche within that as well and grow. So yeah, it's so diverse in what you can do.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. Thanks for giving that to us. Adding to the reality of being a person of color in this space, right? You were also navigating more than just medicine, visibility, identity, sometimes resistant, right? So I wanted to sit in this moment with you and ask you, was there ever a time whether you questioned whether the field was meant for you?
Yeah, a number of times actually, probably. But I think when I was a student, I went into this field with nobody that looked like me to inspire me to get in. So I went into vet school and I was one of probably 5 people of colour in my class. And in my whole vet school, there was probably 20. When you want to be a vet, you just want to pass your exams. You want to put everything else to a side or put it somewhere in the back of your mind, because at the end of the day, it's all about going forward and passing your exams. So bang, 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 you pass your exams, you'll hear comments, you'll face different barriers, but no, you can't speak up because you're the only one like you and you don't want to be a problem, you don't want to affect your results. Go through vet school and then you need to get a job. So you go, right, I don't care whether these barriers, I'm going to keep fighting. And things like your name and things like that will put people off, but you keep fighting and you get your first break. And then you get into a job and then you're like, well, this guy's given me this opportunity, I've got to be grateful. So what you do is you don't speak up, you don't deal with it, you just keep fighting to become an experienced vet. And what you feel is every time you're going up that ladder, you get into vet school, you become a vet, you get your first job, you work for 2 years, you work for 5 years, you get postgraduates. The other barriers and other stuff is going to come away because people are going to respect you for that rather than what they see in front of you or what they hear that comes out your mouth, the accent, or the name. What I realised is that doesn't happen. What I found was I was facing it, and no matter how much more I was ticking all the other boxes, I was still facing it. And then it hit me, and I can talk a little bit about BVEDS, but I was an experienced vet and I got called out to a farm, and then the farmer rang my boss and said he didn't want me because of the colour of my skin. Anyway, I didn't get sent out to that call. I remember going back into the practice. It was a weekend on call. I was on my own doing these calls, and on Monday I went back and actually I went to my boss and said, what are we going to do about it? And actually it then hit me, it didn't matter how good a vet I was, that farmer just didn't want me because of the colour of my skin. And sitting there, I think, was the biggest realisation that it doesn't matter how much more I try and do and try and prove myself, people are still going to judge me on physical characteristics or cultural characteristics that I cannot change and I cannot hide. And I did question, whether it was the right thing to do. And the problem was I didn't get any support or anyone to support me on that issue. And I tried to stick it out for 6 more months. And I left clinical practice because I decided, farm clinical practice is not for me, and people like me. And when I asked for help from my regulatory board, my associations and my mental health charities, nobody would support me at that point. And so I left. I did leave clinical practice because of that. And then I took a full circle because, and we'll probably go into it later, but with the things that we started to talk about and try and change and things like that, I actually went back into clinical practice after a long period because I found a practice that actually wanted me for me and would support me rather than judging me and feeling like I have to change for them. What they want to do is change for me. And so it can happen. But yeah, I questioned it and I left it. But I came back and things are better. They're not perfect.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story. And things are better. And you are a big advocate and reason why things are better. That's probably one of the hardest experiences that you've had to kind of face, especially as an early career professional, and realizing that, yes, I'm doing all of this, I'm going to be accepted, and actually, no, that's not how it works. And so out of those experiences that you went through, and I'm sure you have plenty, you went on to co-found the British Veterinary, Ethnicity and Diversity Society. Right?
Yes.
That was a space that did not exist before. Is this part of the reason why you started the organization? And what were you hoping to change?
When I was in the clinical practice, I was in the countryside. I was a farm vet. I had probably 7 years experience behind me and all bits and pieces. And I remember just sitting there and trying to ask the different associations, will you look after me? I'm paying my dues. I'm a member of this profession. What are you going to do? This is what I'm facing. What are you going to do? And people were passing me off. It's not our problem. It's not our problem. And I was getting passed around. And I was on my own. There was no one I could call to talk about this who would understand me. I remember talking to one mental health charity and they said, look, I'll be honest with you, I'm a white man. I will never know how it feels to be a person of colour. And I can only have sympathy for you, but I don't have any advice. And I just wanted somebody to put the hand around my shoulder and go, it's going to be okay, this is what you can do. Nobody could do it. And so when I left clinical practice at that point, I went to industry, and I remember sitting in an office, and I remember having this book, this is the policy. If you have a complaint, this is the policy of how it'll go. And I thought, wow, there's a policy for complaints. I looked around the room, there were accountants, and there were people, there were black people, brown people, women, men, in a room, and I was like, I've never sat in this much diversity in my life. And then actually I thought, okay, it's not fair. Why should I have had to leave clinical practice and no one support me? We're one of the oldest professions, one of the highest professions when it comes to how people respect in society, yet they wouldn't support me calling out racism. And then I thought, actually, I was on my own sitting there. How many other people are like me sitting around the country facing the same problems I'm facing and they've got no support? Where do they go for support? So then I just thought, do you know what? I'm in an environment where I feel secure. I'm going to challenge the system. And that's when I challenged the system. What I tried to do was challenge the system on my own. I tried to knock on doors and say, you're wrong. It's completely wrong what you're doing. And it's embarrassing. The CEO of the RCV, the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, the CEO of the British Veterinary Association, and I turned up to their offices. I had documents from the Law Association, the Engineering Association, the British Medical Association. I said, here's their policies for racism. Where is yours? And nobody had anything. So at the time, there were no policies against discrimination or racism when I first started to call it out. And I said, this is embarrassing. You're hiring people within your business. You're looking after, 20,000 vets in this country, and you haven't got a policy against racism. They didn't. Anyway, when I tried to call it out and do things on my own, what I realised was it was easy to close the door on an individual. And that's when, after 2 or 3 years of doing it on my own, I decided, look, we need to have people behind us. We need to have a voice behind us. And that's what's going to change people's minds. So I remember looking at Facebook one day. One of the people I studied with at vet school, she was writing about the sexism and racism she was facing. And she was working as a farm vet up north, and I was working down south. We hadn't really talked much since we left vet school. This was sort of 10 years later. I remember contacting her saying, look, I see your problem. I'm facing the same problem. Let's do something together. And literally on the mobile phones, and we were about 400 miles apart, we created BVEDS overnight. And then what we did is then when we went back to these organisations, we said, as an organisation, speaking on behalf of black and brown people within the veterinary profession, we think what you're doing is wrong. We think the whole situation is wrong. We want to make a change. And that's how it all started. But I remember one of the things that I was told to do was to write a blog about the racism that I'd faced, because I needed to make people aware that this exists in the sector. And this is when I was doing it on my own. And I remember trying to pen this document, but I was so scared to put my name on it. And they were like, no, don't worry, we'll support you. I said, no. Because if my name's out there and I'm calling out racism and it's going to make lots of people uncomfortable, then I'm going to get black marks. I remember there's a blog, and you can probably Google it somewhere, and it's where I wrote the first time I'd ever written anything in public about racism. And actually, it's probably one of the first articles of racism in the British veterinary profession was published anonymously. And that, for me, was the starting point of when racism was actually spoken about, and about the experiences of people of colour within our UK veterinary sector.
So much I want to dive into there. Congratulations for being brave enough to do such a thing, right? What was the feedback that you received after this anonymous letter went out, right? I will say that in the US, there's lots of diversity organizations, and around this specifically in vet med, in animal welfare, lots of support, all of those things. I've been to the UK several times, and some of the feedback that I think, or what I've seen is that racism, or, maybe it's a myth. Racism doesn't really exist in the UK. That's a US problem, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've heard that before, but if you can break that down for us. But I'd also really love to know, what was the feedback from the post, the blog?
The feedback from the people who knew that I'd written it was positive, and it did create conversation. Unfortunately, because it's the first time, there were a lot of people who don't like change, especially in the UK veterinary profession. Change is very slow. We're probably sort of 10 years behind general society in a lot of ways. So there were pockets that sort of dismissed it as just a one-off incident, as in somebody who didn't have any resilience, somebody who couldn't hack it and wanted to blame something else for why they couldn't cope. But I did have some people who said that they had thought about that, people of colour who thought about it, and they found some connection with that, and they were happy that it was out. And I think for me, it helped with my strength to go, do you know what? Now I've got that out of my system, I feel like I can be more of an advocate, and we can start to talk about this more. The problem with the UK is we've got a massive problem with, most of the UK, I'm trying to, with history, understanding the UK history. Now, the UK like to be exceptionist. It likes to have be the creator, be the inventor, be the inspiration for the rest of the world. And it likes to have said it did it on its own. And when you learn history at school, you start at the Second World War. You don't talk about anything before. Or you talk about the Romans or the Greeks, and you have this romantic idea about what history was all about. And when we talk about slavery, and we talk about things like that, it's an American problem, because slavery wasn't in the UK, it was an American thing. And what they don't understand was who sold the slaves, who brought them over, who created the movement of people that we see today. And also, how did the UK fund all the things that it did? It didn't do it on its own. It had the history of empire, the history of slavery. It's almost said as that's distinct from British history. And because of that mindset of there is a difference between those histories, it's the same with the history and understanding of racism and of prejudice and of discrimination and of poverty in other countries. And that's why, when it comes to things like wars, and we think about modern history and stuff like that, people don't understand how it's linked to previous history and how Britain was implicated in all those different things. So it's a defence mechanism. And, when I went to the US and I tried to link, slavery with British colonialism and how our histories are massively linked, it's always dismissed like, no, that's nothing to do with us. That's an American problem. And only now are there more and more scholars looking at actually how these histories are linked. But it's still early days.
And you have done a lot of traveling. You came to the US specifically to look at this, right? To compare this. So you were awarded the Nuffield Farming Scholarship. And for our listeners that might not be familiar, this is a prestigious international research opportunity given to leaders in agriculture who want to explore the complex global issues, supported by McDonald's, Harper Adams University, and the Frank Parkinson Agricultural Trust. And it's helped shape policy and practice in meaningful ways. So you use that platform to ask difficult questions about race, about history, and who gets to belong in agriculture. And that study took you around the world. Again, shout out to our sponsors. This episode of Critters and Cultures is brought to you by Maddie's Funds, a family foundation that believes in a world where every pet has a loving home and every family has the support they need to stay together. Inspired by a beloved miniature schnauzer named Maddie, the fund is transforming animal welfare through innovation, education, and equity. So whether it's funding groundbreaking foster programs, supporting community collaboration grants, or offering free online learning and animal care professionals, Maddie's Fund is investing in the people and ideas that move us forward. They also believe that inclusion matters because real change happens when we uplift every voice in this work. Learn more, get involved, or start learning today at maddiesfund.org. You can find it in the show notes, but that's MADDIESFUND.org. And always hashtag thanks to Maddie's. So Thebe, going back to the Nuffield farming study, right? I read the full report. Love it. I was just reading and turning pages and reading, and we'll make sure we put it in the show notes. What I appreciated for sure was how intentional you chose the states that you visited, right? Because of the higher percentage of Black and minority farmers, even though there's still a very low number, but the cultural and historic context definitely matters. So you listened deeply to people there. What did that experience open your eyes to?
It opened my eyes to, we have a massive difference in experiences, but there's a huge amount of connection with some commonality of experiences. And I think there's more that connects us than divides us. For me, it was also learning about myself. I think talking to other people and understanding about their cultures and their barriers and their experiences and their celebration and their successes actually was a massive learning experience for me to understand other people. And even though we're divided by coast and maybe some of our cultures, there's still a lot of things that we share. I was inspired by a lot of people there. Again, there's only so much I can do in my small space, and seeing some of the things that they're doing and the ways that they've overcome different challenges. Because the US is not just, again, it's a huge amount of diversity within the US. I think over here we think that New York is the US or Texas, probably New York or Texas. Right. So two extremes. We're actually, when I was going through the different states, the different people and the different foods and the different cultures, and also, it was really, really eye-opening, I think. But I learned so much that I could bring back to the UK in ways that we can make things better and the way that things can work. So yeah, I was so grateful for everyone that spoke to me and took me on and shared their environments and their livelihoods with me, which was fascinating.
I think that's a great call out. Sometimes what happens is when we have lived experiences, we think that they're everyone's lived experiences, right? Even as minorities, right? So challenging ourselves, what you said is you've learned so much about yourself from just traveling and listening deeply to people and listening to their lived experiences, which I'm sure probably challenged some of your own assumptions, right? About people, usually, about places, about systems, only to be humbled probably, right? And have some of your perspectives actually shifted. I'm assuming that's right. So you're nodding. 100%. Have you had to challenge your own assumptions about culture, community?
When I look at communities and you think when there's huge poverty in communities, then they can't do as much. But actually what I discovered was they probably can do more because they use the resources they have got much better. And also the other thing is I probably believed that we think about food, food. And so people in poorer communities will naturally just eat processed food and things like that. But what I found was some huge, amazing growing projects going on in really impoverished communities. And people were actually wanting to eat fresh food and grow crops and grow culturally appropriate crops. And I was blown away by how they use lack of resources, but innovating in other ways to do those sort of things. And they don't need education and they don't need handouts and they don't need those sort of things, which we believe that we need to provide. What they need is support in other ways. They need to be given those platforms. In Alabama, I was blown away with in communities where there's a lot of poverty, you feel like they're more broken and people are doing things for themselves. What I found was completely false. That was completely false. When I was in Alabama, I went to one street and what they had done is all the houses had given up their front yards for growing. And another couple of houses, what they did is they were passionate about growing, and so they were growing loads of crops around this whole street. Honestly, and people who couldn't afford food could come and get food for free, and people who could afford a little bit were just donating a bit of money just for tools, and it was keeping kids engaged, out of trouble. It was engaging local people, and people were interacting with each other and talking, and it was a wonderful community. But it was in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city in Alabama, and what I found was actually it brought people together. So we have this image, it breaks people, poverty, and it breaks neighborhoods and society, but actually in those neighborhoods people are very connected and are communicating and are working together to make the best of a bad situation, which is phenomenal.
And I think that's kind of ingrained in the US history, is that Black and brown communities specifically, when Black and brown communities start to use their hands, right, find their own resources, come together, historically there's always been something to knock them down, right? And we see that. So you were able to go to Alabama, which is the South, okay, the South, and see some of that for yourself, right? And I don't equate low income to Black and brown communities. I do want to be clear about that. But for Black and brown communities, I do specifically want to talk about the farming that you mentioned, right? That land work and some of the history around that. So this narrative that sometimes unspoken, that farming, that land work is backwards, it's dirty, it's for the uneducated, right? And you touched on something very powerful in your report. For many Black and brown communities, it's just the perception is not just about status, but also about trauma, right?
Yeah.
In the UK, there are no officially recognized Indigenous communities. So I learned in your study that we don't say BIPOC. What do you guys say? BPOC? Is it
BPOC.
just BPOC? Yeah. Okay. But many people of color were forced to work the land to provide for the British, right? Including through slavery. And that history has cast a long shadow. So land work is often seen as brutal, maybe not aspirational. When you visited the US, especially in the South, you saw how that history played out. What are your thoughts? I mean, many young Black and brown people, do they want to work in the land? I mean, you see this beautiful community that's building and growing and all of that. Is that something that you, and even in the UK, is that something that you see as being pushed more or being accepted more? Or does it remind Black and brown communities too much of oppression?
Yeah, so you're right. And I think that's the thing, like even when immigrants come over from their countries of origin, if they've come from farming is seen as a very rural peasant sort of lifestyle. So when they come to countries like the US and the UK, they aspire to be working in suits or working in big buildings and owning cars, and it's finance and law and those sort of careers. So, even my parents will have that mindset, even if you're a vet, why are you a farm vet? You should be a small animal vet, and because they associate, pet ownership with wealth. It's that sort of thing. There's a couple of different things I think has changed the narrative slightly. So the first thing is power and land ownership, food. And if you've got control over your own land and your own food, that gives you power. And I think we're starting to reclaim, as Black and brown people, we don't have that power because we don't own land. We don't have control on our food systems. And actually what we're understanding is if we want to have more power in society, more say in society, we need to control our own food systems and our own land and have land ownership. And I know in the US there's a big thing about land ownership, and especially Black farmers losing that land over time. I think it's from 10 million acres to about 1 million acres left of Black land ownership. But owning land is a source of power. So some of that narrative is starting to come through. I think that where do we see role models and inspiration as well? So I think that before there was nobody else, especially in the US and the UK, that looked like us that was farming. But I think that's slowly starting to change, and there are more visible role models out there for children to be inspired by and to feel like they can do. I think farming also has changed. So again, with my parents' generation and stuff, farming was you're having a cow, you have some chickens, you have a small plough. Now farming is much more, it's driven by technology, it's got AI, it's got data, so it's a much more exciting sector to be in. You can be an engineer, you can be a lawyer, still be involved in agriculture. So I think the image of farming is changing slowly. And again, I might not be interested in digging the soil, but I might be interested in running powerful IT systems or building big transport mechanisms like tractors and things, and still be involved in agriculture. So we've got ways of getting children into it, whether they're interested in maths or science or English, whatever. So I think that's helping as well. I think the problem with it is it's still very grassroots. I think we have got Black and brown growing systems at the moment, but it's very grassroots, it's very small, it's very community driven, it's not commercial yet, and we need to get that into commercial. And the other thing is about reflecting our own cultures. So again, food in the US and the UK, it's driven by commodity, it's driven by what the masses want, and therefore we don't see ourselves in that food system. Yet at home I ate a lot of rice. We don't grow rice in the UK, but actually, and I ate a lot of vegetables that we used to buy from ethnic shops. But actually, if we can grow those crops in the UK, and we can grow those crops in the UK, suddenly I can grow a crop that I can eat that actually is reflected in my culture, and suddenly I have a connection in that food system. So, when I was in the US, I saw Jewish farms, I saw Hindu farms, I saw Muslim farms, I saw African Americans growing all sorts of, culturally relevant crops that they then cooked and then they could eat and they could share in the community. So I think that bringing those sort of things in was going to inspire the children and the next generation to go, do you know what, farming has a relevance to me. It's not something that we see on TV that's far away. It's actually something that people like me can belong in and do things. But I think it's finding those pinch points and making it more relevant. And I think sustainable and regenerative agriculture is the way forward, because that's linked to African, Asian, Southern American, Native American ways of growing. And so actually we need to bring that social justice into those sort of forms of growing and agriculture. And I think that's the way forward, because the big tech, the big companies, Nestle's and all them, they are really looking at sustainable agriculture and they want it. And we need to make sure that social justice is part of that.
Phoebe, you've done amazing work. You have shared so much with us. What are you most proud of? Not the public wins, but maybe something quiet that you carry with you.
One of my pros. Do you know what I'm proud about every time I go into a room and I see more people like me? And I know that I'd seen none, 10, 20, 12, 15 years ago. Now I'm starting to see more and more people. And another thing I'm really proud about is when I start these scholarship schemes for people of colour to apply, normally you'd have 2 places and you'd have 2 applications. And now I could fill them up 10, 20 times over, because people are coming and they want to be part of it. So what I really, really enjoy is when I see other people thriving in our sector. And sometimes I feel like hopefully I made a 1% difference to give them that opportunity to get into our sector and thrive.
I love that. So I'm going to challenge you here. You have BVEDS, right? And in the US, there's lots of diversity within vet med organizations. I'd love to see kind of a partnership, right? I'm sure that there, outside of the scholarship and the study, lots of ways to collaborate. Have you thought about any ways to continue collaborating with some of the US organizations?
Sure, yeah.
Or partnering? Yeah.
100%. So that's a big thing. I think we can't do it on our own. And I think the more collaboration and joint work we can do, the bigger the voice is. So the Multicultural Veterinary Medical Association, we've done some talks for they had an online conference, the RISE conference. We did some talks. They are constantly working with us. The National Association of Black Veterinarians. So again, we had somebody come 2 years ago to their conference, and that's the one conference I really want to come one day. You've got the Manners organisation, so minorities in, I don't know the full thing, but I know it's about minorities in agriculture.
Minorities in agriculture, natural resources, and related sciences. Why? Because I was heavily involved in that.
Oh, were you? So I'm inspired by them, and I was planning to come to one of their conferences, and then COVID hit. But I'm always got that as something I want to come and visit. But definitely, I think we try and keep the conversation going. I did talk about decolonisation once with Multicultural Veterinary Medical Association, but yes, always open to doing more, working more, and I think that's always something that I try and drive to.
Yeah, and just to call out, are there any specific needs that you need right now for, maybe for our listeners?
Do you know what? I'm always happy to talk to people. I think I'd love to engage with more people. If anyone wants to get in touch and wants to chat, and I've got plenty of, if you want an opportunity to speak here, I'm happy to find a space, and I'm happy to speak for you. And I think the more we talk and we engage, I think the better. So I'm always happy to talk to people. I enjoy talking with different people. So please get in touch.
Yeah, I love that. I think it does start with the conversation. If your younger self could see what you're doing now, what do you think he'd say?
Whoa. Well, I imagine my job being, I'll be treating animals head down, and that would be it. I never thought how my journey would be. I always thought I'd be in one clinic for the rest of my life. Where I start is where I end. I'll be treating cows, and that would be the end of it. How things have evolved and gone forward, yeah, it still blows my mind. But I think for me, I've grown as a person, and I hope that when I leave this earth, I've made a difference, and that's the main thing.
Yeah, that's the goal. Before we close, I ask each guest to leave a piece of cultural relevance, something meaningful from your life, identity, or heritage that someone out there might carry with them. It could be a tradition, a proverb, a memory, a favorite dish, or even a value that grounds you. What's something that you'd like to offer as a cultural gift to our listeners or to whoever comes next on this journey?
The one thing that connects all cultures is food. And for me, if you ever want to get to know somebody or who somebody is, go through food. And I think when I was in the US, as much talking as I did a lot of eating. And I think when we shared food together, we bonded more. And for me, food has a huge relevance, whether it's religion, culture, and for example, cows. I'm passionate about cows, and cows have a massive relevance in a huge number of different religions and cultures. So what I would say is, when you're trying to understand somebody new or learn about somebody new or understand about a new culture, look at what are their main dishes, what are their main foods, and how do they eat them. And I think you learn a lot about somebody through that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Thank you for sharing your culture, your experiences, your lived experiences, your research, everything that you're doing for the industry of veterinary medicine on a global platform. Anything that you'd like to add that maybe I missed, or something that you wanted to touch on?
I just want to thank you very much for having this opportunity. You know, I really enjoyed being honest and speaking, and I really, you know, I'm grateful for you giving me this platform. So thank you very much. And I just think that we're all in it together. We can celebrate our successes together. We can fight the barriers together. And I think platforms like this and others, I think the more we connect and we work together, I think the better the world can be. So I'm really grateful. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm so happy that we are in each other's network. And to the listeners, thank you for joining us on Critters and Cultures, where we explore the deep connection between animals, humans, and the world around us. Remember, every person has a story, every creature has a story, and every culture has its wisdom. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep discovering the wonders of our shared world. Thank you.